Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream.
And I'm Malika Bilal. Today, can legal marijuana put an end to Mexico's drug cartels?
Join our conversation. You can tweet us at ajstream or leave your comments in our live YouTube chat, and you may well be in the stream. Mexico is set to fully legalize marijuana. That's a move proponents of cannabis believe will help curb rampant gang violence. But critics say drug cartels would start trafficking other drugs or move on to non-drug related crimes like human smuggling and fuel theft. Regardless, Mexico's Supreme Court has ruled that the prohibition of marijuana violated the Constitution and ordered lawmakers to come up with a legislative framework.
And the deadline to do so is this week. So joining us from Mexico to discuss this, in Cancun, Juan F. Torres Landa. He's a lawyer and Secretary General for Mexico United Against Crime. In Mexico City, Deborah Bonello. She's a journalist and founder of Mexico Reporter. Also in Mexico City, Joan Grillo. He's a journalist and author of El Narco, Inside Mexico's Criminal Insurgency. Welcome, everyone, to the stream. Now, we got so much feedback on this because emotions are high. People have opinions about this. But I want to start our conversation with someone who is involved in this intimately. This is Alejandro Madrazo. He's a professor in Mexico, and he also advised the Ministry of Interior on the revision process for this bill. Have a listen to what he told the stream.
Mexican Congress is about to regulate marijuana, forced under a court order to change the law in order to move away from prohibition. After 5 years almost, Congress is finally moving along towards regulation. This is a huge move. It's very important for Mexico. Mexico has been enmeshed in an absurd drug war for the last 13 years, which has taken homicide rates beyond any historical limit that we had ever since the revolution. So it is very important that we do regulate drugs in order to move away from that very violent phase.
So Juan, he calls this a huge move. Is that how you're feeling as well? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm a little bit biased because I'm very close to Alejandro, so we're part of the same gang, if you will, that has been advocating for change in the policy in Mexico. We were among the first ones to actually advocate for the Supreme Court ruling that eventually authorized us to get personal permits for marijuana consumption. And that meant that we are convinced that the quicker we move away from prohibition, the better off we will be. The reality is that violence in Mexico obviously is the result of many factors. But one of the most important ones is the financial strength of organized crime that was very evident, has been very evident for a while. And of course, last week's events, we had 3 very significant events in Michoacán, in Guerrero, and in Sinaloa that proved precisely just what type of enemy we have in front of us, how well organized they are, and how financially, important their resources may be. So unless we change that logic, we will just see those events repeated themselves over and over again. And I think people are fed up with violence, and we deserve something better than just being witnesses to an increased level of challenging the state, challenging the government, or in some cases, replacing the state as such. That's the situation we're living in Mexico. It's a real tragedy.
One, for people who are outside of Mexico not following all the detailed domestic news that's happening, those 3 events, very quickly, 1, 2, 3, were what?
We had basically 2 events where policemen were killed in Michoacán and then subsequently in Guerrero. And the third one that might have gotten a lot more coverage within and outside of Mexico was a failed attempt to initially capture the Chapo's son, Ovidio, and then to see how the organized crime reacted. They actually were able to seize the city. They were actually to seize, armed forces, families, etc.
Yeah.
And by effectively exerting pressure, they obtained the release of the son, and effectively defeated, the effort to impose, order of justice. So we just saw how rule of law disappeared in a few hours because of the size of the opponent.
Deborah, the minute that you knew that Juan was going to be in our conversation, you had questions. You had immediate questions. What were they? Go ahead.
I mean, I'm a big fan of legalization and an end to the prohibition era. I think my curiosity is, first of all, whether he thinks the bill will pass at the end of October. That was certainly deadline that was given. But also I have concerns as to how effective legalizing marijuana is going to be in stopping violence. I mean,
let's just deal with the first one first of all, because I think that's really important.
Okay.
Because you have a deadline, Juan. There is a deadline.
Yeah, I'm very hopeful that I share the sort of questions, but I also share the fact that we have in front of us a golden opportunity to finally deliver on what the government has offered. Bear in mind that the current government controls Congress, so the only thing that is really required is political will. They don't need to negotiate. They don't need to talk to anybody else. They just need to act and deliver on their promises. And this particular promise is included in the National Development Plan. So it's basically part of their agenda. The big question here is whether the president, who ultimately controls everything today, is sympathetic and actually coincides with that agenda. So that we will know in a matter of a few days. And if he doesn't deliver, then we'll know that we don't have symmetry between what is being said and what is being done.
So, Johan, I want to bring you into the conversation here, because when we asked the question to our online community, will legalizing marijuana help reduce violence in Mexico, we got back several answers. This one stuck out to us. This is Oliver Shackles, who says maybe 20 years ago it might have. What do you think of the why now and the fact that this is a little too late?
Well, I understand what he's saying. Like 20 years ago, Mexican drug cartels were not as powerful, were not as violent as they are today. You've had 20 more years. I mean, they could be making, we don't really know, but say $30 billion every year selling drugs to Americans, plus the stuff they do in Mexico. So over 20 years, that's like, $600 billion of resources going to them. They're buying guns from the United States. They're training hitmen. They're buying heavy weaponry. And we see the violent chaos that is happening today in Mexico. But I'm still completely supportive of Alejandro and of Juan in this endeavor. Now, I do not think it will likely reduce violence in the short term. The problem is that drug cartels already, they are trafficking all the heroin they can. Already they are trafficking all the crystal meth they can. Already are moving all the cocaine involved in human smuggling. And if you go to the United States right now, undocumented, you have to pay money to the Mexican cartels to do that. But in the long term, Mexico has to deal with this problem of drug cartels who are taking chunks of the country. And what we saw on Thursday that was mentioned was 800 drug cartel hitmen rising up and taking a major city. 800 guys with guns, with Kalashnikovs, with 50 cals dominating this city. Now, if you really want to reduce the power from them, then you need to start talking about legalizing some drugs. However, President Lopez Obrador, I think, is confusing this argument about ending the war on drugs. The idea of ending the war on drugs is to take money away from these groups, not to surrender to these groups and allow these kind of actions to happen.
Deborah, this is where you were taking us with your second thought here about the idea that just legalizing marijuana will help Mexico with its drug cartel and drug issue. Go ahead, you had more to say.
I mean, there are some basic economics in that argument, which my two colleagues will already know. But marijuana has long stopped being the cash cow that it was for the cartels 20 years ago. As we've seen state-level legalization happen in the United States, a black market continues to exist, and Mexico used to be the biggest supplier of illegal marijuana to Americans. But as you can now buy your legal weed of all strengths and sizes and flavors in the US, the demand for marijuana from Mexico has gone down. I took a brief look at the Customs and Border Patrol seizures before we came online. In 2013, they were seizing more than 2 million pounds of marijuana at the US borders per year, and that's dropped to 250,000 this year. So, as Yo mentioned, these are poly-drug trafficking organizations, and increasingly we're also seeing a drop in the demand for heroin paste, and there's been this very, very important switch to synthetics, both in terms of what the drug trafficking organizations are producing and what people are consuming. So I'm talking about fentanyl, which is killing more Americans in the United States than any other drug. I'm talking about methamphetamine, which is a huge killer in the United States and increasingly a problem in Mexico. And this is where a lot of the organizations are starting to focus their energies on in terms of drugs, as well as obviously cocaine. But marijuana has long been probably the least important part of their portfolio. So I feel like, okay, let's take those revenues away from them, and that's great. And like Johan, I absolutely support the end of prohibition of everything, if you ask me. So you can tax it and you can regulate it, but just marijuana, I think it's not even going to make a dent. I'm sorry. I hate to be pessimistic, but in terms of violence.
I think the concept is way bigger than this. I mean, this is a first step towards regularizing or regulating all drugs. I think what we shouldn't dispute is that we need to open the discussion, and marijuana is a first step. But by definition, anything that we leave in the context of prohibition is something that the organized crime will be very happy to organize and to keep for themselves. So the discussion here doesn't end with marijuana. It starts with marijuana, and it should go on to every single substance. The state should have never relinquished control of these substances, as it does, for example, regulate tobacco, alcohol, or medicines. It needs to regulate everything, because anything that the state does not regulate, it is regulated, but it's regulated by organized crime, which then fuels their other activities by monopolizing the economy of that market. So they are using those funds to diversify into other very significant activities like Johan was referring to. So they don't need to diversify. They've already been diversified. What we need to stop is their economic power that allows them to have so much dominance in all of those other activities. And marijuana, again, is the first step towards a long-term process. We've taken decades to get to where we are today. It'll take a few years to improve things, but unless we start walking in that direction, we'll just see more dramatic events like those of last week.
I'm glad you raised that, Deborah, in the first place, because so many people online are thinking the same thing. This is James, who's watching live on YouTube. James has laugh out loud. It's the cocaine that is worth the money, and the amphetamines. Another person writing in, watching live, NS. The big problem is really not associated with marijuana. It's more like methamphetamines and cocaine. So several people on the same wavelength. But I hear your answer to that one. So keeping that in mind, I want to play a video comment from someone else. This is Gladys McCormick. She's a chair in Mexico-U.S. relations at a university here in the U.S., Syracuse. And Johan, I'll give this to you. Here's her thought.
The decriminalization of marijuana in Mexico won't actually do much to alleviate the current security crisis south of the border. The majority of drugs are actually consumed by those outside of Mexico and tellingly the United States. And on top of that, the decriminalization of marijuana doesn't address issues of corruption and impunity. And we saw those on display this past week in Mexico with a series of massacres in places such as Michoacán and Guerrero, and most telling in the capture and subsequent release of Ovidio Guzman, the son of El Chapo Guzman, in the streets of Culiacán and Sinaloa on Thursday. So all of this goes to show that this decriminalization is basically a Band-Aid, and it doesn't address the root causes of what's driving Mexico to be so violent today.
Johan, what do you make of that, and how to then address the root causes?
Okay, so I differ with some of these ideas. We have to remember that marijuana, even if the amount of marijuana going to the United States has been reduced, we still have marijuana produced by drug cartels going to the United States as we speak. So there is still people who are buying cannabis, buying weed in Texas. You pay $20 for it. That $20 goes to a drug cartel. That money is going to Mexico, that is used to buy guns, that is used to pay assassins who are carrying out horrific murder. And I mean, we've all heard the numbers, but the humanitarian catastrophe here, when you have mass graves with 250 bodies, when you have many regular parents crying, trying to find their disappeared children, this is a catastrophe that needs to be addressed. Now, to say that this is a Band-Aid, I do not agree with. It's not going to solve all the problems. This is a major, difficult, long-term crisis to deal with, but you have to start somewhere. So if you begin...
do, but I would argue that if the... Go on.
Okay, like if you talk about corruption, you have to deal with corruption, but you deal with corruption by taking away the drug money. If the drug cartels are getting, let's say, $30 billion a year from selling drugs to Americans, we don't really know, that's an estimate, then that is a huge amount of money to bribe police officers, to bribe politicians. So again, you fight corruption by this same path to trying to reduce the black market of drugs. And at the same time, we need more, rehab programs for Americans who are taking heroin, who are taking crystal meth, who are spending, that
So Johan, let Deborah into this conversation, because she had a rebuttal. So go ahead, Deborah, go ahead.
I mean, I agree with Johan on to a certain extent, but what I would argue is that the drug cartels in Mexico are aggressive capitalist organizations. And one thing that I have actually been impressed by over the last 2 years is how they recognized the market opportunity that the synthetic opioid fentanyl has offered them. So what you see, yes, marijuana is still a revenue stream for them, but it's small, and they have proved themselves absolutely capable of adapting to changes in demand for drugs. So I think they will quite easily replace any revenue streams that they lose out of marijuana. Secondly, I would argue, and again, I'm slightly playing devil's advocate, but this has to be a bilateral effort. And when you look at the violence that's playing out in Mexico, yes, its domestic market for recreational drugs is growing, but legalizing drugs on this side of the border is only going to be, is only part of what has to be a huge bilateral effort. If the United States doesn't start moving towards legalizing cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, then those products will remain in the high levels of demand that they are today. So I wouldn't say it's a band-aid, but I think this is a small step of a very long process.
But a very small step is better than nothing. And what you've said basically is true in the sense that the U.S. is already walking in that direction. So why should they expect us not to start with marijuana? The U.S. 30 states have some way of regulating marijuana. In some cases, where we have now hard data that supports the fact that that is a good move. Colorado, Oregon, Washington have very good information as to why it is now being dealt with as what it should have been all the time, which is a health-related problem, not a safety problem, which we turned out or converted this into by prohibiting drugs, which, to someone who hasn't had the time to explain or understand this is very similar to alcohol prohibition. I know there's some critics that say that it's different, but the very basics are very similar. And nobody would dispute with me that the U.S. alcohol prohibition was a good decision. It was actually a devastating one, a very bad one. Well, this is very similar. Prohibiting drugs has not created any benefit for anyone except for organized crime. So the minute we realize that, we better build into a different direction.
I think Mexico also needs to move towards a changing culture in terms of drug consumption, because Mexico is a very conservative society, and you do have this sort of criminalization and marginalization of people who consume drugs. And I think prohibition is a very, very important step towards that.
Deborah, as that culture changes, there is a question about what to do with those who are left behind, namely farmers. So I want to share a video comment we got from someone who wrote this piece. Her name is Zara. And the headline of this piece, you can see where she stands: Mexico's historic opportunity to get cannabis right. Now, she sent us this video comment. Have a listen.
Hi, my name is Zara Snap from Instituto RIA in Mexico. This week, the Mexican Senate is debating how to regulate cannabis, and this will include 3 access routes: cultivation for personal use, which has been recognized by the Supreme Court, cultivation in association, and a regulated market, which must put at the center the communities that have cultivated illegally and that must now have the opportunity to transit to a regulated legal market, using social justice and reparations to change the conditions of our country.
So how best to center those communities that she talked about?
I think that's been one of the fundamental tensions in writing this bill too, is trying to bring in structures and institutions that are going to bring in the impoverished farmers and the humble farmers in the mountains who for years have survived on marijuana and poppy cultivation. That for me is a key part of making this work, offering them alternatives to be part of this new legal industry, which it's yet to be seen whether that's been written into the bill, but that would be one of my concerns. Last time I was in the mountains of Sinaloa, which admittedly was in February, farmers were telling me that they could barely sell the marijuana that they were growing.
I would bring another concept because we're talking about cultural barriers and the like, and I would dispute that the fact that in reality, what we have been having for many years is a lack of information. The reality is that the government has systematically wanted to support drug prohibition as a valid policy and to tell us, lies like it's because of your children, it's because of many things. The reality is that it's never worked. So the minute we have hard facts and information about what's really happening, I can tell you the culture goes away. The reality is we need to understand the size of the problem to then understand the size of the solution. I would find it very difficult for anybody to say that what happened in Culiacan last Thursday is part of our culture and something we cannot change. I would say it's precisely the opposite. We need to have hard facts as to why this is happening and how we solve it.
Let me show something to you, because you mentioned Culiacan, and I visited Deborah's Instagram site, and then I also visited Yuan's Twitter account, and they showed very similar pictures. You are talking about a part of the world that you know very intimately, so this is not going to be a shock to you. But for our audience, let me show you Culiacan from just recently. This is from Deborah's Instagram feed. This is for our benefit of our audience. Okay. And the comments.
Look at the weapons. Look at the weapons they're using.
And the comments are people like, this looks like a movie. This is real life. And then let me just switch across to here. This is from Yuan's Twitter, and he reshared this. And again, Culiacan shooting at police with a 50-bore rifle, 50 caliber rifle. Excuse me. Again. Look at this equipment. This is extraordinary. Right. So, Juan, you were talking about political will. All we need is political will. But this is a place where the drug cartels are so powerful. How is political will? How is that enough?
I think political will. Yeah, we can change the laws. We can change the principles that enable these guys to buy those type of rifles. The reality is that they're not buying them because they're very efficient or because they're very competitive, or because they're real entrepreneurs. The only reason they can buy those weapons is because they have a monopoly. And prohibition gives them the right to actually be the only ones entitled to cultivate and distribute and sell drugs. If that was regulated just as we do, again, with tobacco, alcohol, and others, the matter would be different. And one important thing is that we regulate things differently. We don't regulate everything the same, because obviously the power and the consequences of using some type of drugs is very different. So sometimes, one type of drug may be used for recreational purposes, like a wine or alcohol or something, but then it's different. But you need to make sure that you regulate things differently. And part of the culture has been this silly idea that we are criminalizing our children, or that we don't want to criminalize them because they have access to drugs. The reality is they have access to drugs, but we don't know what they're selling them. We just know they're selling them pills of all colors. We need to change that, and change that for the sake of our children.
All right.
And do so as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Juan. Yuan, just very quickly, because we're right at the end of the show. Make your point very quickly. Go ahead.
So I think just the point there with the 50 caliber rifles, and it's a conversation about drugs, but about drug trafficking. Those 50 caliber rifles are coming from the United States. And there's documented evidence of people being able to buy those in US gun shops with the same laws that people are buying shotguns or pistols. So that has to change and has to be in this conversation, and hopefully reducing the money drug cartels have will reduce their budget to buy such weapons.
I want to close from our community with this video comment we got from Guadalupe Corona Cabrera and her thoughts on this moving forward.
On the legalization of marijuana as a way to fight organized crime and violence in Mexico. This is not going to be an effective strategy, because we need to remember we're not talking about drugs or drug policy. We're talking about criminal organizations that have diversified their activities, that have access to high caliber weapons and militarize their strategies. They can adapt very fast to the needs of the market and provide for the market the drug that the markets need. Also, we need to understand this is an institutional problem, and we need to fight this problem, fighting corruption and building institutions needed for this effort.
The perspective of one person, of course, many more comments online as well.
Thank you to our guests. Thank you, Juan and Deborah and Yuhan, for talking about the idea about decriminalising marijuana in Mexico and the impact it may or may not have. This conversation continues always online, and you will see Malika and myself on ajstream the next time. Take care, everybody. See you soon.